All right, so you've picked your kit out, and like I said, I'm gonna look at this DO335. I think it's a really cool airplane. It's got a neat history, and it's odd. I like odd things. So the first thing you're gonna do is get your parts out, and I've washed my parts off. It's nice to wash these off in the sink with a little bit of soap and water to get the mold oil off of them. And I've cut some of the parts out already, and what I'd like to do is just show you, it's very important to cut the parts off properly so that you don't damage the actual part. So there's little sprue connection points all along this wing, and I'm going to take my little nippers here, my Tamiya nippers. I like Tamiya products. I think they're a very high quality tool. And what you want to do is line your nippers up right along the edge of the part and snip it off so that you don't cut into the part. I'm going to do that on each point. Turn this around. And take your time. I do it fairly quickly because I do this a lot, but you notice now that I've cut this wing off, it's pretty smooth all the way around, but there are a couple little bits of plastic from where I cut it off. So I can take my knife and I can trim that piece, cut that little nib off. And then what I do is after I do that, I grab myself a piece of sandpaper. I have this new Tamiya sandpaper, and I've got some FlexiGrit sandpaper. Then I just look at that and feel it, and if it feels a little rough, I just take the sandpaper, sand it down a little bit. But like I say, you just want to make sure that each contact point from the sprue is cleaned off. So that you got a nice, clean cut. And then you'll take the other piece it mates to, and before you glue anything together, test fit the part. In other words, put it together. There's usually little pins and holes in the wing or the other, whatever the part is, and they'll fit together. You can see I've got it fit, and I'm looking at it just to make sure everything fits nicely. Then I could take it if I wanted to. I have this piece assembled already, and I can fit it onto there also just to make sure how this thing fits together. It's very important to do test fitting on a model, because if you just go ahead and glue things, you may miss a step or you may miss something that will affect you down the road. 2 steps later, you might, oh, I wasn't supposed to glue that together. I didn't read the instructions. So make sure that you test fit your parts, test fit sub-assemblies together, and then go ahead and start gluing. And I like to use liquid cement. There's tube cement, liquid cement. We've discussed this before. This is Testor's liquid. And what I'll do is after I fit these parts together, I'll take this cement, and the Testor cement comes with a little brush inside of it, which is pretty broad. It's a pretty big brush. And you can use that if you like. And basically you dip it in, and you just run it down along the seam line, and the capillary action will take it into the part, and you squeeze them together, and you'll see a little bit of plastic come out of there. And that's good, because that works like a filler. And when it's dry, you can just take your sandpaper and sand it down. Also, if you think that this brush is too big, just get a standard little modeling brush. And I keep my old brushes that are getting beat up for this purpose, and I can dip this into the glue and get it down into smaller areas. So that's gluing your parts together. Once you get them glued together, I'm going to move this out of the way. Let's put him back in here. I'll move this box over. Once you get your parts glued together, you're going to notice that sometimes, especially on older models, parts don't always fit together perfectly. Some of the newer kits, they fit really nicely, and you don't have to worry too much about sanding and filling. But this Monogram kit, it's Monogram Revell, it's an older kit. This goes back about 40 years. And when I put it together, I noticed that there are some areas on here, like the seam lines. And this is important. When you put your parts together, when you glue this airplane together, the fuselage, it's very important to put it together and take note of where the seam lines are, where these things fit together. Do your best to get it together without a gap, but on older kits, sometimes you just can't avoid there being a little bit of a gap there. So note, I've got a seam line here. I'll look up at the front. I've got a seam line here. Here along the spine of the aircraft, there's a seam line. So what I did was, I glued this all together, and I went back and I started to sand down along those seam lines, along the spine of the aircraft, along the nose, along the bottom. I haven't done the bottom yet. I saved that because I figured I'd do a little demo here. I like to take my sandpaper, and this is Tamiya sandpaper. This is really, really good sandpaper. I like it a lot. And what I'll do is I take my sandpaper, grab a sheet of it out of here, and I don't use this whole sheet. What I do is I take my knife and I just cut a piece of the sandpaper off. Or you can use scissors, whatever you'd like to use. And I take it and I fold it. And then I like to bend it a little bit so it's curved on the surface. And I just take that and I just sand along that seam line that's on the bottom. And like I said, if you glued it together and you get a little bit of that plastic, soft plastic coming out, that works as a filler. So I'm going to basically sand this thing down. Until it's smooth. And you can see I did that on the top spline. I did it on the nose of the aircraft. I did it underneath here. So go ahead and sand everything down here. And once we get it all sanded down, we're going to hit it with a little bit of primer. And I'll show you that in a second here. All right, I've sanded down all the seam lines on this airplane. And it's not perfect by any stretch. But when I prime this, and this is the next thing I'm going to do, is I'm going to shoot some primer on this airplane. And it'll show me where the imperfections are so that I can go back and we'll take a look at fillers and putty. This is really important. This is what'll make your model different from everyone else's. This will take it to the next level. So we're going to look at fillers and putties next. All right, so I've put my plastic parts together, like the two fuselage halves, and I went ahead and I took my sandpaper and I sanded all the seam lines down. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use this Tamiya Fine Surface Primer on the model, and I'm going to shoot the model lightly. And the reason I'm doing this is so that I can look at the seam lines after there's paint on it, and you'll be able to see where there's gaps, where there's areas that need to be filled. So let's take this Tamiya primer and I'm going to shake it up really good. Always shake your spray paint up really well. And also, when you use spray paint, always do it in a well-ventilated area. Put rubber gloves on and use some sort of respirator on your face so that you don't breathe in the fumes. Very important. I'm going to put my glasses on. And we'll just do a little. And I'll go ahead and I'll do the whole thing, and then we'll take a look at it. All right, we've shot some primer on this fuselage now. The reason we primed this is so that we can take a look at all those seam lines that I spoke about and see where we need to apply some of this putty. So if we look carefully at this fuselage, I notice that right up front here, there's an engine cover that has a nice gap right here, and there's a little bit of a gap in the front. Flip it over. There's a little bit of a seam line right here underneath of it. And there's some seam line showing on the back spine here of the fuselage or the underbelly. Up on the top, some slight areas, and on the side engine cover area, I can see some gaps that I want to fill. So what do I fill them with? Basic model putty. I have Tamiya putty here, and I have some Vallejo acrylic putty. The Tamiya putty is really good for large areas. In other words, when I look at this and I have some really big gaps, I can use the Tamiya putty and it bonds really well with plastic. Takes a little longer to dry than the acrylic, but it's good for big open areas like this big gap right here. The acrylic putty is good when you look at some of these spine areas that just have little marks and just slight lines that need to be filled. They're not gaps, they're just kind of like indents. So I'll take that acrylic putty and just put it on there. So what kind of tool do you use to put the putty on? Myself, I use some very basic things. I like to use old X-Acto blades. Keep your X-Acto blades when you're done with them, when they're dull, when they break. They have a nice straight edge on them that's really good for scooping up putty and putting it right down on some of these seam areas like this. You can also use popsicle sticks. You can take that, a little bit of putty, put it on depending on how much you need to put on. These things are almost like a putty knife. Think about using a big putty knife to put spackle on your wall. You're doing the exact same thing. You want to get it into the gap areas and things without getting too much on the rest of the model. So let's put some putty on. The first thing I do is I always put rubber gloves on. I like to have rubber gloves on my hands when I work with paints and adhesives and chemicals and things. Just don't want to take a chance, and I recommend it. You can get rubber gloves at any Home Depot, any hardware store. So I'm going to use some of this Tamiya putty to fill this big giant gap that's in the front of this cowling area. So pop it off, and I usually use either styrene or some sort of material that's not going to soak the solvent out of this. So I'll put a little bit of putty on my plastic there, cap it back up. Do this in a well-ventilated area too. Make sure you got your window open, or you've got some airflow. You don't want to be breathing too many fumes. So we'll take this guy, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some putty on this knife blade and just kind of drag it across the gap so that I don't get too much on the rest of the model. So a little bit of putty on the knife. Just kind of do this number. And just put enough on there that it fills that gap without getting too much on the rest of the model. And you want to try to smooth it as you go. And I'm going to let that dry. When it's dry, I'll take my sandpaper and go over it. And after I fill all the gaps, I sand all the putty, then I'll shoot it with a little bit more primer just to make sure I filled everything. Now, on some of the areas, like on the bottom here, where there's just a very slight gap, I'm going to use the acrylic putty. So I'll put this guy down, take this guy, a little bit of that, and the same thing. I'm going to take an X-Acto blade, a little bit of this putty on here, and just kind of anywhere that I see there's any kind of gappage or any distortion, just put a little bit of this putty on here. Now the acrylic putty, one of the neat things about that is it's water-based, so I can take a little bit of water if I like, put it on my finger, just kind of rub it over the putty and smooth it out. And it usually stays in the gap areas and the excess comes off. Don't do that with Tamiya. You can't use water on Tamiya. That has to dry on its own. But you can do this with the acrylic putty. So we'll let that dry. I'll do the rest of it and then I'll shoot some primer on it. So I've gone ahead and I've puttied the fuselage here, and you can see where I've put the putty. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let it all dry. Then I'm going to go back with some lightweight sandpaper, sand it down, and then shoot a little more primer over it. So that's basic puttying, and after I sand it and we prime it, we'll take another look at it. Now that my putty's dry, I want to go back and I want to sand it. And I want to be very careful. I'm using a 400 grit sandpaper here. The grits on your sandpaper run from, say, 180 up through 1,000 or more. The higher the number, the finer the grit of sandpaper. So I usually use a 400 to take down the putty on the side of the airplane. So I'm just going to sand this a little bit, give you an idea of where I'm heading with it. As you sand, you'll notice that the putty will stay in the gap areas, and you'll get a feel for this. I mean, it's not something that it's a feel thing. It's like riding a bicycle. Once you start to do it, you'll start to feel how it should be. So I'm just going to sand down. And this one looks a little heavy because there's a rut right there that I wanted to fill in. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to sand all this down. And you notice those big giant gaps that were here are disappearing now, which is really the goal, is to get rid of gappage. And then I can go back to the front here where this big one was, and go sanding on there. And you'll notice I'm breaking through the primer too, which is okay, because once I get this thing sanded down, I'm going to shoot it with another coat of primer. And I may have to putty some areas again, I may not. You can see that this is all filling in right where that big giant gap was, which is the goal. Down to the bottom. Just a little bit of sand. And so forth. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to sand this all down till it's smooth, hit it with another coat of primer, and when I'm happy with it, then I'll go on to the next area of the model.